I still remember that night like a scar carved into my memory. The city was cold even though the air didn't carry snow or frost. It was the kind of cold that crept inside your bones, a quiet reminder that no one was waiting for you, no one was looking for you. I sat on the cracked sidewalk near downtown, my back pressed against a wall that smelled like damp concrete. A torn piece of paper lay across my knees. I had found a stub of charcoal earlier that day and had spent hours sketching, losing myself in shapes and shadows because they were safer than reality. My hands were thin and rough, stained with street dust, and yet the lines I drew were steady. Drawing was the only thing that reminded me I was still alive. When you have nothing, no home, no family, no one, you hold on to the smallest things, like their oxygen. My name is Lila Parker. I was 26 years old at the time, though I felt much older. Life on the streets has a way of aging you quickly. I was invisible to most people, just another forgotten soul blending into the background noise of the city. But that night, someone saw me. I didn't know then that his gaze would be the beginning of something that would change everything. A sleek black sports car pulled up at the light across from where I sat. I didn't pay much attention at first. Fancy cars came and went, carrying people who would never know what it felt like to count coins for a meal, but I felt it a weight of someone's eyes on me. When I looked up, he was staring. A man in a tailored suit, his face chiseled with the kind of cold confidence that belongs only to those who have always had power. I didn't know his name then. I didn't know that he was a man who thought he could buy anything, even life itself. The light changed and he drove away. But minutes later, as I was packing up my paper to find a safer corner to sleep, I heard the low purr of that same engine again. The car stopped right in front of me this time. The tinted window rolled down with a smooth, almost theatrical slowness. "Hey, you, come here." His voice was low and controlled, like someone who was used to being obeyed. I froze. My first instinct was to walk away. Men calling out to women on the street rarely meant anything good. But there was something in his tone, not pleading, not curious, just commanding. Against my better judgment, I got up and approached the car slowly. Up close, I could see him better. He was in his early 40s maybe, with sharp features and an expensive watch glinting beneath his cuff. His eyes were piercing, not warm, not kind, just piercing. "I don't have all day," he said when I hesitated. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice flat. Living on the streets teaches you not to show fear, even when it's clawing at your insides. "Get in the car," he replied. I laughed, a harsh sound that didn't feel like mine. "I'm not one of those girls," I said. His jaw tightened. "Don't be absurd. I just want to talk. You can either get in or go back to sleeping on the sidewalk." It was the way he said it, like he already knew I'd have no choice, that made my stomach twist. He wasn't wrong. A part of me hated that. Another part of me was curious. What could a man like him possibly want with someone like me? So I got in. The leather smelled expensive. The silence between us was heavy, almost unbearable. He drove us to a small, quiet cafe away from the chaos of the city. I wanted to bolt the moment I stepped out of the car, but his presence had a gravity I couldn't explain. We sat across from each other at a table in the corner. He ordered coffee for himself. I didn't order anything. I didn't trust free things. There's always a price. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lila Parker," I replied. "Why does it matter?" "Because I like to know who I'm dealing with," he said simply. His voice didn't waver. Everything about him was unnervingly controlled. "Lila, why do you sit out there drawing like nothing else matters?" I clenched my fists under the table. "Because what else is there to do? I lost everything. And it's none of your business." He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and looked at me the way businessmen probably look at investment deals. "Then let's get straight to the point. I want to make you an offer, something that can change your life." I almost laughed again. Men with money love to say things like that. "What kind of offer?" "I want you to have a child for me." I stared at him, blinking slowly, trying to figure out if he was joking. "What?" He didn't flinch. "I'll cover all your expenses, take care of you during the pregnancy, and give you a sum of money that will make sure you never have to live on the streets again." I let out a shaky, bitter laugh. "This is a joke." "It's not," he said, his tone like steel. "I don't want a relationship. I don't want emotions. I just want a child. My child." I thought I'd misheard him. I thought I was trapped in some sick fantasy. But his eyes, calm, calculating, told me he meant every word. My throat went dry. The idea alone made me want to scream, but it also made something inside me ache, because part of me was listening. "What happens after the baby is born?" I asked finally. "You'll get your money, you'll be free, no strings attached." His words echoed in my mind like a blade dragged slowly against glass. No strings attached. How could there be no strings? A life grows inside your body. You give it breath and then, what, hand it over like a product? "Why me?" I asked, my voice quieter now. "Why not just adopt?" He stared at me for a moment, and for the first time his voice softened, but not by much. "Because I want an heir. Someone with my blood. Adoption complicates things. Relationships complicate things. I don't want either. I want control." That word control landed in the pit of my stomach like a weight. I walked away that night with his offer burning through my mind like a fever. He had given me 24 hours. I lay awake on a park bench, my fingers curled against the thin fabric of my jacket, the wind gnawing at me like it always did. His words kept circling a way out. Stability, a new life. I hated him for saying them because deep down I knew they were true. No one was coming to save me. No one ever had. When I showed up at his building the next day, I saw no surprise in his eyes. It was as if he had known all along that I'd come. I walked in with my head high, pretending I wasn't trembling. "I accept," I said. He smiled, not a warm smile, but one of satisfaction. Good. The contract was long, every line sharpened to protect him. It promised medical care, housing money beyond anything I'd ever seen. It also stripped me of any right to the child I'd carry. I read it twice, every word sinking like stones into my chest. And then with shaking hands I signed. I remember riding in that black car again, only this time I wasn't a stranger sitting on the sidewalk. I was someone who had sold a part of her future. When the car passed through the iron gates of his mansion, I felt both awe and nausea. The house was enormous, the kind of place that looks like it has no soul. Chandeliers, marble staircases, art on the walls. A silent kingdom built for one man, Stephanie. His assistant showed me to a room bigger than any apartment I'd ever lived in. The bed was soft, the sheets were clean, the bathroom had gold fixtures. I should have felt grateful. Instead, I sat on the edge of that perfect bed, gripping the sheets like they might swallow me whole. This wasn't a fairy tale, this was a transaction. The next weeks were a blur of doctors' checkups, carefully prepared meals, and strict routines. Henry kept his distance, watching everything like a man managing an investment. But sometimes when I caught him looking, there was something else in his eyes, something even he didn't seem to understand. One night I stood alone on the balcony of my suite. The garden stretched out below, perfectly manicured, perfectly still. My hands rested on my stomach, still flat then, but already different in my mind. I whispered into the darkness, "Am I doing the right thing?" No answer came, only silence. It wasn't love between Henry and me. Not then. It was control and survival and the cold calculation of two broken lives crossing paths for a purpose neither of us fully understood. But deep inside, a quiet part of me already knew. No matter how much I told myself, this was just a deal, nothing about carrying a child. My child would ever be simple. The morning sunlight that slipped through the floor-to-ceiling windows didn't feel warm to me. It fell across the room like a spotlight, exposing every hidden fear I tried to bury the night before. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of a house too large for one person. Everything about this mansion screamed control, every polished surface, every perfectly aligned picture frame, every corner stripped of spontaneity. In the beginning, I thought silence meant safety, but in this house, silence was just another way to remind me I didn't belong here. The first time Henry and I crossed paths after I moved in, it was in the long, echoing hallway that led to the library. I was returning from another routine medical appointment, something his assistant Stephanie scheduled with military precision. He was walking toward me straight-backed in an impeccable suit, the kind of man who never seemed out of place anywhere. He stopped a few feet away. His gaze swept over me quickly but not cruelly, just assessing. "Are you feeling well?" he asked. His tone wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. More like someone checking that an investment was performing as expected. I guess I answered softly, unsure what else to say. He gave a small nod and started to walk away. But just before he did, he glanced at me one more time and added, "If you need anything, ask Stephanie. I want you to be well." It was such a simple sentence, almost robotic, but it stayed with me long after he disappeared down the hall. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to hate the man who had turned my body into a contract. But every time I saw him, something about his quiet precision unsettled me, not because it was cruel, but because it was painfully controlled. He had built an entire fortress of rules to keep the world at bay. And somehow I was inside it. Days turned into weeks. My body began to change in small ways, subtle signs of the life growing inside me. It terrified me more than I expected. I told myself this was just a deal. I told myself I was strong enough to separate emotion from reality. But late at night, when I stood at the balcony with my hands over my stomach, I could feel a heartbeat that wasn't mine, and I knew I was lying to myself. Henry and I rarely spoke in those early weeks. He lived like a machine work meetings, calls endless hours in his home office. I saw him in passing, his reflection in the glass hallway, the sound of his shoes against the marble floor. Yet even in that distance, I started to notice things I shouldn't have. The way he paused every time he passed the nursery being prepared downstairs. The way his voice softened almost imperceptibly when he asked Stephanie for updates on my health. He didn't care about me, not as a person, but he cared about control, and the child was part of that control. One night, I was in the living room alone. The house smelled faintly of polished wood and something floral Stephanie must have arranged. I had picked a book from one of the shelves, not because I wanted to read, but because I needed to feel something other than fear. I was tracing the lines on the page when I heard footsteps behind me. Henry entered the room, distracted, holding a folder of documents. He froze slightly when he saw me, as if I'd appeared somewhere he didn't expect me to be. "I didn't expect to find you here," he said. "I didn't expect you to talk to me," I replied before I could stop myself. My tone carried a sharpness I didn't fully intend. He frowned but didn't walk away. Instead, he placed his folder on the table and sat across from me. "Are you settling in?" I shrugged. "It still feels strange, like none of this is real." "It doesn't have to feel real," he replied calmly. "It's an agreement, Lila. A contract. Everything will be carried out exactly as planned." I laughed quietly, shaking my head. "You plan everything, don't you? You live like there's a formula for life." He leaned back slightly, studying me as though he wasn't used to being questioned. "That's how I built everything I have. Planning prevents failure. Sometimes failure is inevitable," I said softly. "You can plan everything, but you can't control how you feel." The silence that followed was heavy. It felt like I'd hit something raw beneath the layers of his carefully constructed armor. His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't respond. And for some reason, that silence felt louder than anything he could have said. He left shortly after, and I was alone again. But that moment clung to me, a tiny crack in a wall I had assumed was unbreakable. The more time passed, the more the mansion began to feel like a gilded cage. The food was good, the bed was soft, the air was warm. But none of that could soften the weight pressing against my chest every day. I'd made a deal, and that deal had a deadline. But then something shifted. One afternoon, I was sitting in the garden, tracing shapes on a blank page of a sketchbook I had found in my suitcase. I liked the garden best because it was the only place that didn't feel like it belonged entirely to him. The air was open, real. I didn't hear him approach until he spoke. "Enjoying the garden." His voice was lower than usual, less sharp. I turned my head and saw him standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets. His posture was, as always, perfectly straight, but his eyes weren't as guarded. "It's nice," I said honestly. "Better than the streets." He sat down on the bench beside me, keeping a deliberate distance. For a moment, neither of us spoke. And then he asked, "Are you settling in?" "It still feels strange," I admitted, "like I'm living someone else's life." "It's all part of the agreement," he said. "I want you to have everything you need so things go as planned." As planned, I echoed, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. "Do you always live like this? Planning every second of your life?" He looked at me, almost surprised. "Planning keeps everything from falling apart." I gave him a small, tired smile. "Not everything can be controlled, Henry. This time he didn't have an answer. He just stood and walked away. But something in the air between us felt different. The man who once only saw me as a vessel for his air had paused not because of strategy, but because my words had actually landed. A few weeks later, he surprised me again. It was during a medical appointment. I had grown used to going alone with Stephanie. But that morning when I stepped outside my room, Henry was already waiting by the door, his coat perfectly buttoned, his presence steady. "I'll come with you today," he said simply. I didn't know why, but my chest tightened. The clinic smelled like disinfectant and warm air. When the doctor placed the ultrasound wand on my skin, I held my breath. A sound filled the room, soft at first, then clearer. A heartbeat, steady, strong. I bit my lip hard. Tears burned behind my eyes. It was the sound of a life growing inside me, the life I had promised to give away. Henry didn't say a word, but when I glanced sideways, I saw something flicker in his eyes. It wasn't control. It wasn't calculation. It was something dangerously close to awe. Everything changed after that day. He didn't turn into a different man overnight. He was still Henry, the man of contracts and plans and walls. But I began to notice small things. He asked about how I felt after appointments. He made sure I had everything I needed before I even thought to ask. And one morning I found a beautifully wrapped package at my door. Inside was a brand new sketchbook and a set of expensive pencils. There was a small handwritten note tucked inside to help with your free time. I pressed that note against my chest for a long time. I didn't want to admit what it did to me. That night, as I sat outside sketching in the garden, he passed by and paused. "Did you like the gift?" he asked casually. "Yes," I said, looking up at him. "Thank you. I didn't expect it." "It seemed like something that could be good for you," he said almost awkwardly before walking away. The moment was small, but it was the first time he had done something not out of obligation, but out of thought. Out of care, even if he didn't understand that word yet. I wish I could say I kept my distance after that. I didn't. Against every wall I'd built to survive, something inside me began to soften. I started to see the cracks in him too. Late one evening, I wandered through the mansion and found him in a study at the end of a dim hallway. He wasn't on the phone or looking at spreadsheets like always. He was holding a framed photograph, his shoulders slightly hunched, a posture I'd never seen from him before. When I knocked softly, he startled and quickly set the picture down. "Sorry," I said. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "It's nothing," he replied quickly, pulling that cold mask over himself again. But I had seen it. Just for a second, the armor had slipped. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling again, feeling the quiet flutter inside me. The baby moving faintly for the first time. My hand pressed gently against my stomach. Everything was changing. Not in the way I planned, not in the way he planned either. But something irreversible had begun between us. Something neither of us could fully control. In the weeks that followed, everything between Henry and me began to shift in ways I hadn't expected, and definitely hadn't planned for. It was subtle at first. Quiet gestures, lingering glances, half-finished conversations that left too much unsaid. But in a house built on control, even the smallest cracks can change everything. One morning, as the autumn light filtered softly through the wide windows, Stephanie came to my room earlier than usual. Her voice was bright, but beneath it there was something deliberate, like she was under strict instructions. "Henry would like to join you for your next appointment," she said, adjusting the cuff of her blazer, as if the detail was nothing, but her eyes betrayed the weight of it. I froze. "Why?" She shrugged lightly. "He just said he wants to be there." He had never asked before. He'd always sent people, Stephanie a driver, a doctor, on standby. His world was one where emotions didn't belong in negotiations, but this was personal. When he appeared as the hallway that morning, already waiting, it didn't feel forced, it felt intentional. He walked beside me down the steps in silence, and yet the air between us felt strangely alive. Not warm, not romantic, just real. The hospital smelled faintly of antiseptic and clean linens. The doctor greeted me with a professional smile, asked me to lie back and place the ultrasound wand gently on my skin. And then that sound again. A heartbeat, stronger than before. For a moment, everything else disappeared, the sterile room, the sharp scent, even Henry standing at my side. All I could hear was the steady rhythm of a life growing inside me. A heartbeat that had nothing to do with contracts or control. A heartbeat that belonged to me, even if only for now. I didn't mean to let the tears fall, but they came anyway, hot and quiet, sliding down the sides of my face into my hair. I tried to wipe them quickly, pretending they didn't matter, but when I turned my head, Henry was watching me. His face, usually unreadable, had changed. There was no smirk, no cold calculation, just stillness. He didn't say anything, but something in his eyes told me he had heard that heartbeat too, not as a transaction, but as something living. The car ride back to the mansion was silent. Not the stiff silence we used to share. This one had weight warmth, even like the air just before a storm. When we arrived, he stepped out first, but then he turned back and, without looking at me directly, held the car door open. It was a small gesture, but to a woman who'd spent months sleeping on concrete, small gestures could feel like earthquakes. The next few days felt different. Henry started appearing in places he never used to. Not hovering, not intruding, just present. In the hallway outside the library. In the garden when I sketched. In the dining room, sitting at the far end of the long mahogany table instead of hiding away in his office. And then came the day of the surprise. Another appointment? Another ultrasound. Except this time the doctor smiled wider than usual. "Well, here's something we couldn't see before," she said. Henry and I both leaned closer to the monitor. "You're expecting twins." For a moment I thought I misheard her. "What?" My voice cracked. "Two babies," the doctor confirmed gently. "Both healthy, both growing beautifully." Everything inside me shifted at once. My hands trembled as I pressed them against my belly, as if I could feel both little heartbeats in my palms. I had barely prepared myself for one child. Two felt like the universe pulling the ground out from under me. I turned toward Henry. He wasn't breathing. His eyes were fixed on the screen, wide, unguarded. A man who had built a fortress around his emotions now stood in the middle of a storm with no umbrella. "Two," he whispered. The doctor nodded, smiling. The car ride home was silent again, but not the same silence. This one was charged, buzzing with something neither of us could name. Finally, halfway through the drive, I said softly, "You don't seem like the kind of man who gets easily surprised." He let out a quiet breath. "I'm not, but this is different." "Are you scared?" I asked. He shook his head slowly, eyes on the road. "No." Impressed. Overwhelmed, maybe. Something inside me cracked again. I wasn't supposed to care, but I did. When we returned, the mansion no longer felt like just walls and polished floors. It felt like something was breathing inside it, something alive and unfamiliar. That night I sat on the terrace, wrapped in a soft sweater, watching the city lights flicker far away. I was tracing slow circles across my belly when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't need to turn to know it was him. His footsteps were always steady, like a man who didn't know how to doubt. "You like this spot," he said as he approached, his voice quieter than usual. "I like the silence," I whispered. "It helps me think." "Thinking isn't always good," he muttered, leaning against the railing beside me. I gave a humorless laugh. "Try telling that to someone who spends most of her time alone." He didn't answer at first. And then after a long pause, he said almost to himself, "Sometimes being surrounded by people doesn't help much either." That surprised me more than anything. I turned my head slightly to look at him. For the first time since I met him, his posture wasn't perfect. His shoulders weren't squared, and his hands weren't clasped behind his back like they always were. "Maybe," I said softly, "you need something you can't control." The words slipped out before I could stop them. He turned to look at me, a muscle in his jaw tightening. He didn't respond. He just walked away, his silence trailing behind him like a shadow. But I knew I'd hit something. The weeks that followed blurred together, but not in the same colorless way they used to. Henry still kept his routines, meetings, contracts, precision. But I could feel him orbiting closer to me, not colliding, just circling, observing, existing near me in a way he hadn't before. It wasn't love, not yet, but it wasn't distance anymore either. One morning, I woke to find a team of workers inside the house. Stephanie explained they were expanding the nursery. 2 cribs, 2 small rocking chairs, warm yellow lights replacing the sterile white ones. I stood in the doorway and stared at it all. This wasn't just a deal anymore, this was becoming a life, and that terrified me more than sleeping on the streets ever had. One night as I was sketching in the garden, I caught myself wondering what it would be like to hold them both at once, my babies. But then I reminded myself they weren't mine. They never would be. Henry didn't know it, but I cried that night. Not because of fear, but because for the first time I didn't know how to separate my heart from the deal I'd made. By the time the third trimester arrived, the weight in my body was matched only by the weight in my heart. My belly had grown so round I could no longer see my feet, and every movement felt like a reminder of what was coming: 2 tiny lives, 2 heartbeats I'd grown to love more than I'd ever planned to. The house no longer felt empty. It was still polished and grand, but now the walls echoed with new sounds: fabric being folded, quiet, construction noises from the nursery, soft conversations between staff about baby supplies. Even Henry, the man who once lived like feelings were a weakness, began spending more time near the rooms being prepared for the twins. I saw it in the way he lingered at doorways, his usually guarded face softening when he thought no one was looking. But I saw him, and every time I did, something inside me ached a little more. Henry had changed, though he'd never admit it out loud. He started doing small things at first, making sure I had more pillows to sleep comfortably, asking Stephanie to adjust the lighting in my room so it wouldn't feel so cold at night. One morning, I woke to find a soft wool blanket folded neatly at the foot of my bed, with a note written in his careful handwriting: "For the nights when the house feels too big." I sat there holding the note like it was something fragile. I wasn't used to being cared for, not like this, not quietly, not without expectation. And then there were the dinners. Before we'd eat separately, I'd take my meals in silence, and he'd lock himself away behind his office door, feeding himself with work like it was air. But one night, out of nowhere, he sat down across from me at the long dining table. No warning, no performance. The silverware clinked softly. The warm light above us made everything glow a little too gently, like the moment itself was trying not to startle me. He didn't speak for a long time. Neither did I. Finally, in that quiet, he asked, "Have you thought about what you'll do after all this?" I looked up from my plate. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of real curiosity. "No," I admitted. "I haven't." "You'll have the resources to start over," he said. "Anywhere. You can build whatever kind of life you want." "Anywhere," I repeated. The word tasted hollow on my tongue. What did anywhere even mean when part of your heart was staying behind? He didn't notice the way my hands tightened in my lap. Or maybe he did, and he chose to ignore it. A few days later, a package was left at my door, wrapped carefully. No card this time. Inside was another sketchbook, but this one wasn't just blank. On the first page, there was a delicate drawing of a tree with 2 small birds in its branches. Henry wasn't the kind of man who drew, but he'd commissioned someone to do it. I could tell. He remembered that I drew on the sidewalk the first day he saw me. He remembered. I pressed my fingers against the page, my throat tight. He wasn't supposed to make it harder, but he was. And worse, he didn't even realize it. It was around that time that I saw him vulnerable for the first time. I'd been wandering through the mansion one evening, restless from a mix of hormones and thoughts I couldn't quiet. That house, with its endless hallways and carefully curated quiet, could swallow a person whole if they weren't careful. At the end of one dim hallway, I saw a sliver of light coming from the half-open door of a study. I peeked inside. Henry sat at his desk, his posture not stiff like usual, but hunched, his elbows resting on the table, his hands holding a small framed photograph. I couldn't see what was in the picture. I didn't need to. The look on his face said everything. This was a man who lived his life never allowing anyone to see his cracks. But here he was, staring at a photograph like it was the only thing in the world real enough to hold on to. I knocked gently, trying not to startle him. He turned startled anyway and quickly set the photo face down. "Sorry," I said softly. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "It's nothing," he replied, the cold mask sliding back into place as if it had never left. But I had seen. And once you see someone's softness beneath the armor, you can't unsee it. I hesitated at the door. "You seemed like you were thinking about something important." He stared at me for a second too long before answering. "We all have things we'd rather keep to ourselves." I could have left it there, but I didn't. Do you always live alone in a house this big? He crossed his arms. It's more practical that way. Fewer distractions. Must be lonely. The flicker in his eyes betrayed him before his mouth could lie. I'm used to it, he said. But his voice was quieter than usual. Not cold, just tired. That night I stood on the terrace long after the house went quiet. I wrapped the blanket he'd given me around my shoulders and stared at the faint city lights in the distance. My hands rested against the curve of my stomach, tracing the places where I could feel their soft kicks. They were real, two tiny lives, and soon, they wouldn't be mine anymore. My heart ached in a way no amount of money could fix. I thought I'd made peace with it when I signed that contract, but back then it was only an idea. Now it was real, living, moving. When I heard the soft sound of footsteps behind me, I didn't turn. I knew it was him. His steps always sounded the same, deliberate, unhurried, like a man who'd never needed to chase anyone. You're always out here, he said quietly. It's the only place that feels real, I admitted. He stood beside me, staring out at the city too. The wind lifted his hair, slightly softening the edges of his usually sharp silhouette. For the first time, he didn't feel untouchable. Thinking isn't always good, he muttered. I let out a soft laugh. Try telling that to someone who's been alone her whole life. He went silent for a moment. Then softly, as if he wasn't quite speaking to me but to the night itself, he said, being surrounded by people doesn't always change that. It was the closest thing to honesty he'd ever given me. Maybe I whispered, you need something you can't control. He stiffened, the softness in him flickering like a flame caught in the wind. He didn't answer, just turned and walked away, his silence echoing louder than words. But I'd seen it, and I knew beneath that wall of control something was beginning to break. The nursery was finished a week later. 2 small cribs, cream-colored walls, warm golden light, little mobiles with stars and moons hanging above the beds. Everything was perfect, sterile, and expensive like everything in this house, but perfect nonetheless. I stood there alone for a long time, one hand pressed against the doorframe, the other on my belly. I should have felt grateful. Instead, I felt like the floor beneath me was cracking. Because this wasn't just a nursery. It was the place where I'd have to say goodbye. And even though I told myself this was just a transaction, the truth was already etched deep inside me. Goodbyes like that are never clean. They leave scars. The day everything changed started out ordinary. I woke to the familiar quiet hum of the house, the soft rustle of curtains shifting in the breeze, the distant sound of staff moving somewhere down the hall, the ticking of an ornate clock on the wall. The twins were growing fast inside me now. Every movement they made was sharper, more insistent, as if they were impatient to enter a world that had already been shaped for them. I sat up slowly, hands resting on my belly, breathing through the heaviness that never really left my body anymore. I had grown used to the routine breakfast prepared exactly the same way each morning, appointments scheduled to the minute, Henry always moving through the house like a precise clockwork mechanism. But what I couldn't get used to was the way his presence had changed. He was no longer just the man behind the contract. He was, whether either of us admitted it or not, part of the air I breathed every day. The contractions came suddenly. At first I thought it was nothing more than the usual ache of late pregnancy, but when the sharp pain doubled me over near the foot of the bed I knew. My breath hitched. Another contraction hit stronger, making me grip the edge of the nightstand to keep from collapsing. I called out for Stephanie, my voice trembling, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. Within minutes, she rushed in, her face instantly tightening with concern. Henry needs to know, she said, her hand firm on my shoulder. This could be it. When he appeared in the doorway, I barely recognized him. The carefully composed man who always moved like he was in control of every second of his life was gone. His face was tight, his eyes wide with something raw I had never seen in him before, fear. Leela, what's happening? He asked, crossing the room quickly. I clenched my jaw against the pain. I think it's time. He froze for half a second, just half. Then, like a switch had been flipped, he started moving, calling the driver, ordering Stephanie to pack everything needed, issuing instructions with the precision of a man who always has a plan. But even through that controlled chaos, I could see it, this was different for him. He wasn't giving orders to build a company or close a deal. He was fighting to hold on to something he couldn't control. The ride to the hospital blurred into fragments, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. His hand gripping mine tightly, his thumb tracing small circles against my skin. I wasn't expecting him to hold my hand, but he did. Not like a businessman making sure a deal went through, but like a man who couldn't stand the idea of losing something fragile. "We're almost there," he whispered, his voice steady but low. "You'll be okay, we'll be okay." And for the first time, I believed him. The delivery room was bright, too bright. Machines beeped steadily. Doctors and nurses moved in quick, purposeful motions. My world narrowed to the pounding of my heart and the crushing waves of pain that felt like they were splitting me open from the inside. Henry refused to leave the room, no matter how many times the nurses gently suggested it. He stood at my side, his hand gripping mine, his voice the only steady thing I could focus on. When the first baby cried, the sound ripped through the room like sunlight breaking through a storm. "A boy," the doctor announced, smiling. And then moments later, the second cry came. A girl. Two cries, two heartbeats, two tiny lives that I had carried every day, feeling their movements in the dark, whispering to them when no one else could hear. I couldn't stop the tears. They poured down my face as the nurses wrapped them in soft white blankets. My chest ached so hard I thought it would burst. I wanted to hold them forever. I wanted to memorize their faces, their scent, the warmth of their skin against mine. When they placed the boy in my arms, his tiny fingers curled around mine instinctively. My breath caught in my throat. I looked down at him and saw the softest, smallest miracle. And then the girl. She was so light, so fragile, as if the entire world could fit into her tiny clenched fist. Henry stood frozen at first, staring at them like he was witnessing something he'd never believed could exist. When the nurse gently handed him the boy, something inside him broke open. His hard, distant expression melted away completely. His lips trembled slightly, his eyes glistened. He didn't even try to hide it. "They're perfect," he whispered. "For a man who spent his life building empires with logic and contracts, holding those babies stripped everything else away. He wasn't the untouchable millionaire anymore. He was just human. And for the first time since I met him, so was I." That night at the hospital felt like living inside a fragile bubble. The twins were sleeping in the nursery wing, their tiny breaths steady and quiet. I lay in my hospital bed exhausted and raw, my body still trembling from the storm it had just weathered. I stared at the ceiling, feeling both full and hollow at once. Full of love I never thought I could feel again. Hollow with the knowledge that soon they wouldn't be mine anymore. That was the deal. That was always the deal. But then the door opened softly. Henry stepped in, carrying both babies, one in each arm. I had never seen him hold anything so carefully. He wasn't a man used to fragile things. He'd built a life on hard edges and absolute control. But here he was, cradling something that didn't bend to plans. He walked slowly toward me and sat on the edge of the bed. When he handed me the boy, his hands lingered like he didn't want to let go. "This changes everything," he said quietly, almost like he was admitting a secret to himself. I looked at him, at the man who had once offered me a contract, like a king offering a coin to a beggar. Now he was sitting here, his entire world unraveling in the tiny fists of two newborns. "I know," I whispered back. My voice cracked, because it was changing everything for me too. The following weeks were a blur of sleepless nights, soft cries, tiny breaths, and quiet moments that carved themselves into my soul. I spent hours sitting in the nursery holding them, memorizing their faces, their warmth. Every heartbeat felt like a countdown toward goodbye. Henry was different now. He didn't retreat into his office anymore. He hovered near the twins, clumsy but determined, changing diapers, holding bottles, sometimes just sitting in silence watching them sleep. He was trying in his own way to learn how to be someone he had never been. And in those quiet hours, something happened that neither of us had planned for. We stopped being strangers bound by a deal. We became something else, something that terrified us both. Because when you've spent your life surviving, letting someone in feels like walking into a storm without an umbrella. The contract hung over us like a shadow. It always had. But now it felt like a blade. I'd lie awake at night listening to the babies breathe, feeling Henry's quiet footsteps pacing somewhere down the hall. And in the dark, I'd whisper to myself, I made a deal. I knew what I signed. But another voice, softer and far more dangerous, whispered back, but your heart didn't sign it. I loved them. And slowly, whether I wanted to or not, I was starting to love him too. In the days that followed their birth, everything I thought I knew about my life and about Henry began to unravel in slow, quiet waves. I had expected to feel only pain, maybe detachment, maybe a cold finality when the twins arrived. I hadn't expected this. The nursery, which once felt like a set piece for someone else's story, was now full of small, imperfect moments. Tiny breaths, soft whimpers, restless nights that blurred into dawn. My body ached. My emotions were raw, and my heart was doing something I didn't know how to control. It was holding on. Henry had changed. There was no denying it anymore. The man who once kept his distance from everything emotional now spent hours near the cribs, awkwardly rocking the twins to sleep, learning how to hold a bottle without looking like he was negotiating a hostile takeover. I saw him in those quiet moments when no one else did. He didn't know I watched from the doorway, as he whispered something to our son, or perhaps to himself. His voice, usually clipped and steady, was soft, then almost uncertain. That uncertainty was what undid me. Because it was real. I had never imagined this man could love anything he couldn't control. And yet here he was, standing in the half-light of early morning, a fragile newborn in his arms, his carefully constructed world bending around something he couldn't have predicted. I didn't sleep much in those weeks. My body was still healing, and my mind was at war with itself. Every time I held the twins close, I remembered the contract, the ink on the paper that spelled out what my future was supposed to be. I was supposed to leave, start over, disappear. But how do you walk away from the sound of your own children breathing? How do you silence the feeling of their tiny fingers curling around yours like they belong to you? How do you look at a man who once represented nothing but cold transaction and see someone trying in his broken way to be something more? The night it all came to a head, the house was quiet, the kind of silence that wraps around you like a heavy blanket. I was sitting on the nursery floor, my back against the wall, one twin in each arm. They'd just finished feeding, their eyes fluttering between wakefulness and sleep. My hair was messy, my body exhausted, my soul stretched thin between love and fear. I didn't hear Henry walk in, I just felt the shift in the air. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching. His tie was loosened, his hair slightly disheveled, and for once he didn't look like the man who owned the world. He looked like a man who had finally found something to lose. "You're awake," I said quietly, not turning my gaze away from the twins. "I couldn't sleep," he replied, his voice lower than usual. He stepped inside slowly, like he didn't want to disturb something fragile. I kept hearing them. "And you?" He knelt down beside me, not caring about the expensive suit pants he was wearing. He looked at the babies first, really looked, and then at me. His eyes weren't cold tonight. They were full of something raw and frighteningly human. "I didn't plan for this," he said quietly. I let out a shaky laugh. "You planned for everything, Henry. That's what you do." He shook his head, a faint smile crossing his lips. "Not this, not them, not you." I froze. The words lingered in the air like something we both couldn't take back. "You made it very clear what this was," I whispered, my voice trembling. "A contract, a transaction. I was never supposed to matter." He looked at me, then really looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. "You do matter." Those 3 words hit me like a storm. All the walls I'd built around my heart trembled beneath their weight. "I don't know how to do this," he continued. "I've spent my whole life believing emotions are weaknesses, that people are liabilities. But these past months," his voice cracked slightly, and for a man like Henry, even a crack was a confession. "You've changed everything." Tears stung my eyes. I tried to look away, but he reached out gently, hesitantly, and touched my hand. The warmth of his skin against mine was nothing like the cold precision of the man I met months ago. It was soft, scared, real. "I'm supposed to leave," I whispered. He shook his head. "No. Henry. No, Leela." His voice was steady now, but there was a tremor beneath it, like a man terrified of losing something he didn't know how to name. "You don't understand. I don't want this to end. Not with a signature. Not with you walking away like none of it mattered." My heart pounded so hard it hurt, but that was the agreement. His jaw tightened. Then slowly, deliberately, he pulled something from the inside of his jacket pocket. The contract. The same contract that had decided everything for us. He held it for a moment, staring down at the paper like it was the last piece of a life he no longer wanted. Then, without a word, he began tearing it apart. The sound of the paper ripping echoed through the room like thunder in the quiet. Piece by piece, the contract fell to the floor. "Henry, what are you doing?" I choked out. "What I should have done the moment I realized I didn't want this to be just a deal," he said. "I want you to stay." My breath caught. Every part of me wanted to believe him. But the years I'd spent being discarded, ignored, unloved, they screamed at me to be careful. "How can I trust you?" I whispered. "How do I know you won't change your mind?" He leaned closer, his voice soft but fierce. "Because I already tried living without feeling anything for anyone, and it left me empty. You and the twins. You filled something in me I didn't even know was missing." I didn't speak. I couldn't. The tears came hot and fast, slipping down my face as he gently reached for my hand again. His grip firm but not demanding. "I love them," I whispered, "so much it hurts." He nodded, his voice almost breaking. "Me too. And I—" He paused, his breath catching. "I love you too, Lila." The nursery was quiet, except for the soft breathing of our children. The air between us was heavy, trembling with everything that had been left unsaid for too long. I didn't give him an answer that night. Love for me was something dangerous. I'd spent my entire life surviving on my own, expecting nothing from anyone. But the truth was already written somewhere deep inside me. I loved him too, and that terrified me more than anything else ever had. The next morning, the world outside was still gray with the first hint of dawn when I made my choice. I walked down the long hallway toward the nursery, still wearing the robe from the night before. My heart pounded, my palms were slick with sweat, and every step felt like it carried years of fear and hope tangled together. When I opened the door, Henry was already there, holding the twins, humming softly, off-key, awkward but real. He turned to me when he heard the door, and there was no mask on his face, no distance, just a man who, against all odds, had let something break him open. "I'll stay," I whispered. He didn't speak. He just closed his eyes, and in that moment I saw something I had never thought I'd see in him: peace. I walked toward him, tears spilling down my cheeks, and wrapped my arms around him carefully, around him and around the tiny lives between us. For the first time, I wasn't running from anything. I was walking toward something. The morning I decided to stay felt different, so achingly quiet it was as if the house itself was holding its breath. A soft golden light spilled through the nursery window, touching the edges of the cribs, where my babies lay asleep. For weeks, that room had felt like a ticking clock counting down to goodbye. But that morning, it felt like the beginning of something I had never thought I would have. Henry stood by the window holding our son in his arms. His hair was still a little messy from the night before. His shirt was wrinkled. And for once, the man who had spent his life wrapped in control looked soft. His eyes lifted when he heard me come in. "You're up early," he said quietly. I smiled faintly. I couldn't sleep. He nodded, shifting his gaze back to the baby in his arms. Neither could I. I walked closer, barefoot, my heart pounding, as if I was stepping across some invisible threshold. I gently touched the edge of the crib where our daughter slept. Her tiny fists curled against her cheek, her breaths light and even. Just looking at them made something deep inside me tremble, a mix of awe, fear, and a love so fierce it made my chest ache. Henry looked at me, the kind of look that sees everything without demanding a word. "Lila," he whispered. "Last night, did you mean it?" I met his eyes, my throat tightening. "Yes, I'll stay." His breath left him like he'd been holding it for far too long. He didn't smile. Henry wasn't the kind of man who smiled easily, but something in him loosened, as if a weight he'd been carrying all his life had quietly slipped away. He walked closer, still holding our son, and without asking, he reached for my hand. The warmth of his palm against mine was steady, grounding, real. I closed my fingers around his, and for the first time since I met him, it didn't feel like we were on opposite sides of a deal. We were simply two people standing in the same fragile, terrifying, beautiful place. The weeks that followed were not a fairy tale. They were messy and exhausting, and full of moments that stripped away every layer we'd both built to protect ourselves. The twins cried at all hours. My body was sore. My heart was still learning to trust. Henry struggled too. He was clumsy, out of his element, so used to being in control of everything, and suddenly holding two tiny lives that refused to follow his carefully drawn plans. He made mistakes. So did I. But somehow, amid the sleepless nights and the quiet dawns, we began to build something real. He learned how to hold them without being afraid. I learned how to lean on someone without feeling like it made me weak. We talked more. Not the stiff, shallow conversations we used to have, but real ones. About the past. About the walls he had built to survive the way I had built mine too. He told me about the photograph I'd seen him holding that night in the study. It was of his parents, both gone. Now the only time in his life he remembered being loved without condition. I told him about the years I spent alone, the nights on the street where I used to whisper my name out loud, just to remind myself I existed. It wasn't romantic in the way stories usually are. It was something quieter. Something that grew in the spaces between the words, in the way we looked at each other when we thought the other wasn't watching. Love didn't fall on us like a thunderstorm. It crept in slowly, like sunlight warming a room that had been cold for too long. A few months later, the house that once felt like a cage no longer felt like it belonged to just Henry. It was ours. The polished marble floors were covered with blankets and soft toys. The once silent halls echoed with the twins' giggles and cries. The library smelled faintly of warm milk and formula, instead of the sterile perfection it once held. And Henry, God, Henry had changed more than I ever thought possible. He wasn't perfect. He was still stubborn, still intense, still trying to figure out how to live a life that wasn't planned down to the last detail. But when I saw him holding the twins, when I watched him smile, really smile at their laughter, I knew he'd become something else entirely. A man who loved. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the garden, he led me outside. The air was warm, the sky painted in soft orange and pink. The twins were lying on a blanket, babbling and kicking their legs. He reached for my hand, his thumb brushing gently against my skin. "I never imagined this," he said softly. "This," I asked. "Us." He looked at me, then not like the man who once made me an offer I didn't want to accept, but like a man who had found something he couldn't live without. "I spent years building walls so high no one could get in. And then you walked into my life barefoot and covered in charcoal, and everything changed." I laughed softly, the sound catching in my throat. "I was a mess that day." "You were real," he whispered, "and I didn't even know how much I needed something real until you." I felt tears build behind my eyes, but this time they didn't come from fear. They came from something warm, safe. He took a small step closer, his forehead resting gently against mine. "I love you, Lila." I closed my eyes, letting the words wash over me like a tide I no longer wanted to fight. "I love you too." We married in a small ceremony right there in the garden. Nothing extravagant. Just us, the twins, Stephanie, and a few people who had quietly become part of our world. I wore a simple white dress. Henry wore a suit, though I'd never seen him look less like the man who used to live behind a wall of power. When we exchanged vows, neither of us promised perfection. We promised presence. We promised to keep choosing each other even on the hard days. He held my hand like it was the only truth he'd ever known. When the twins laughed during the ceremony, everyone said it was a good sign. I like to believe it was. Years from now, I don't know what life will look like. I can't promise it will be easy. But I do know this: sometimes the most unexpected broken beginnings give birth to the most extraordinary things. Once I was a woman sitting alone on a cold sidewalk, drawing with a piece of charcoal no one cared about. Now I'm a mother, a wife, a woman who dared to love even after the world taught her not to. And the man who once bought control now chooses love every single day. If you've made it this far into my story, thank you. Maybe your life doesn't look like mine. Maybe it's still messy and uncertain. But I hope you remember this: sometimes the most unexpected people can change everything. And sometimes the family you build is far more powerful than the one you lost. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell me in the comments what part stayed with you the most. Your words mean more than you know.